Rain drips through the shattered glass ceiling of a bombed-out French bus depot on the outskirts of Metz, pooling across the flooded concrete floor in November 1944. Inside the motor pool, 24-year-old Private First Class Raymond Cisneros rests against a tire, wiping greasy fingers on wet coveralls before slipping an oilcloth-wrapped tobacco tin into his pocket. 3 commissioned officers stand around the engine bay of a stalled lead Sherman tank, debating a transmission failure that has grounded the vehicle for 2 days. Then, an unannounced figure in a coat with 3 brass star steps into the bay, stopping the room cold. Cisneros slides out from under an adjacent vehicle and points directly at the rear framework of the tank. In a flat voice he says, "It's not the transmission, sir. It's the mount. She's cracked at the weld. The drivetrain's walking under load." The room goes quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Majors look at the floor, and captains appear to reconsider their entire career path in 2 heartbeats. General George S. Patton turns his head slowly toward the private, his eyes locking onto the smudged grease on the soldier's cheek as the silence stretches. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether Raymond Cisneros had just ended his military career or saved an armored column. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we bring you forgotten moments of quiet courage and unexpected choices from the front lines. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it took for Raymond Cisneros to speak up like that, you have to understand what this motor pool actually was, and how strict the chain of command truly felt in November 1944. The depot on the outskirts of Metz was not a proper repair facility. It was a shelled-out French transit hub with a shattered glass ceiling that let in a relentless winter drizzle. Water mixed with spilled diesel fuel and heavy gear grease, pooling across cracked, flooded concrete floors. Steam rose off hot exhaust manifolds while young men dragged heavy torque wrenches through freezing sludge. The air smelled constantly of burnt oil, wet wool, and damp exhaust fumes. Maintenance here was a daily battle against total operational breakdown. Everything was cold to the touch. Heavy iron tools slipped out of numb fingers, and steel felt like solid ice. You did not work in comfort. You worked until your boots soaked through and your skin turned gray, fighting to keep 40-ton machines from turning into frozen scrap metal. Then there were the unwritten rules of military protocol. In a front-line army, authority flows in one direction down from polished officer's rank to plain canvas sleeves. Privates' clean gear teeth replace worn track shoes and torque pan bolts. Majors and captains diagnose structural failures. They hold the technical manuals and make the official calls. When 3 commissioned officers spend 2 full days debating a mechanical defect, an enlisted soldier does not interrupt them. He stays underneath his assigned chassis, keeps his head down, and minds his business. To step into their circle and tell them they were wrong was to step outside the safety of military hierarchy. Every mechanic in that depot understood the risk. Some of them likely saw the crack or suspected a frame alignment issue, but they kept quiet because personal survival meant staying invisible. Because in late 1944, military operations were governed by hard arithmetic. The Third Army was pushing hard against heavy German defenses around Metz, where every grounded Sherman represented a gap in the armored spearhead. A misdiagnosed transmission meant 2 full days wasted pulling an entire powertrain, 48 hours of lost repair labor, 30 gallons of burned oil, and 1 less tank in the front-line fight. If that lead tank rolled into combat with a fractured mount, the drivetrain would walk under load, locking the drive sprockets during an assault and stranding 5 men in open crossfire. The math of mechanical oversight was measured in lost hours and lost lives. And that was the room Private First Class Raymond Cisneros raised his voice in. Picture the scene. November cold hangs thick inside the depot. Rain drips through shattered glass above, splashing against 4 grounded Sherman tanks. Smudge pots hum softly in the corners, throwing long flickering shadows across wet concrete and grease-stained coats. 12 mechanics and 3 senior officers stand frozen around the lead vehicle, their breathing visible in the frigid air. The smell of raw diesel fuel and scorched electrical wiring sits heavy in the damp space. Private First Class Raymond Cisneros stands in his soaked coveralls, his grease-blackened finger pointing directly at the fractured engine mount. Nobody moves, nobody picks up a wrench. The silence is heavy. broken only by the rhythmic water drops hitting metal. Every man in that flooded bay was making the exact same calculation. The two captains and the major were staring down at the frame, caught between public humiliation and military authority. The motorpool mechanics, men who knew the layout of a Sherman frame inside out, looked down at their boots. Some of them had likely suspected the crack hours ago, but they knew the unspoken code. You do not correct 3 officers in front of a 3-star general. They were measuring the distance between a private's observation and a general's temper. The motorpool NCO stood near the tool racks, uncertain whether to pull Cisneros back or stand his ground. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that frozen motorpool in Metz are remarkably consistent in shape. Nobody remembered a yelling match, and nobody remembered a sudden burst of theatrical temper. They remembered the sound of water dripping onto thin sheet metal, and they remembered General George S. Patton taking 4 slow steps toward the lead tank. He leaned down over the rear framework, staring into the dark seam where the engine met the frame. Not the way a general looks at an insubordinate private. Not the way a commander looks at an irritating delay. He looked at the cracked weld the way a veteran mechanic looks at broken machinery, measuring the metal stress with his eyes. For 15 long seconds, nobody in the depot dared to breathe. Patton did not ask for a manual. He did not ask the 3 commissioned officers to justify their 2-day diagnosis. He simply straightened his posture, looked at the motorpool NCO, and spoke 5 words. Fix what he's pointing at. Then he turned on his heel and walked back out into the French rain without another word. The heavy silence hung over the bus depot for a long time after the general's staff car pulled away. The 2 captains and the major stood motionless in the damp cold, staring at the microscopic fracture in the steel. Nobody spoke a single word of reprimand to Private Cisneros. There was no lecture on protocol, no warning about staying in his place, and no attempt to defend the failed transmission diagnosis. The mechanics picked up their torches and went to work on the mount. By midnight the rear framework was re-welded, reinforced with heavy steel plate, and ready for load C. What most folks don't realize is that George S. Patton had 0 patience for military theater when actual combat effectiveness was on the line. To a man driven by operational speed, rank was merely a tool to organize momentum, not a shield to hide intellectual error. An officer who spent 48 hours pulling a Funke transmission was wasting critical Army resources, but an enlisted mechanic who could spot structural fatigue in 3 seconds saved hours of repair labor and kept an armored column moving forward. In Patton's ledger, competence was the only currency that carried absolute value. A cracked weld meant a stranded tank in the middle of an offensive, and a stranded tank meant dead soldiers. Preserving the delicate feelings of 3 misdiagnosing officers meant less than nothing compared to the cold arithmetic of battlefield reality. By endorsing the private's call without hesitation, Patton sent an unmistakable signal through the Third Army structure. The man who knows the truth of the machine is the man who gets heard. Regardless of how many stars or stripes he carries on his shoulder, Raymond Cisneros was 24 years old, born and raised on the south side of Peoria, Illinois. Attached to the Third Army's Armored Maintenance Company, he was not a career soldier or a man groomed for military authority. His father had spent 30 years as an assembly line mechanic at the Caterpillar tractor plant, where heavy diesel engines and massive tracked frames were built for American industry. Before enlisting, young Cisneros spent 3 full years on that same factory floor. He learned the trade from men who could diagnose a failing bearing simply by feeling the vibration through a steel floor plate. He learned how heat and vibration degraded structural welds, and how microfractures hid beneath layers of industrial paint. Back home in Peoria, his fiancée, Dolores Vega, worked at a local department store, writing letters every week that he kept folded tight. In his breast pocket, tucked safely inside a grease-stained field jacket, was an oilcloth-wrapped tobacco tin holding her photograph. His post-war plan was simple and practical. Survive the European campaign, return to Illinois, marry Dolores, and buy a modest starter house near the river while returning to his bench at the Caterpillar assembly shop. He was not a romantic hero looking for battlefield glory. He was the kind of man who looked at a forged steel frame and saw exactly where the metal was fighting itself. When the official paperwork arrived at 6 o'clock the following morning, elevating Private First Class Raymond Cisneros to Technician 4th Grade, His reaction was characteristically quiet. There was no celebration, no speech, and no posturing in front of the other mechanics in the company. When handed the promotion order, he looked at the official stamp, folded the document neatly into his coat pocket, and immediately asked if the newly reinforced weld on the lead Sherman tank had held up during the dawn road test. Once assured that the drivetrain was running true and that the vehicle was back in the line of battle, he simply picked up his torque wrench and climbed back under a second damaged vehicle. The promotion papers had been delivered to the depot by Staff Sergeant Lyle Brennan, a 34-year-old motorpool NCO from Terre Haute, Indiana. Brennan had spent the entire war maintaining heavy transport vehicles and armored recovery equipment across France, and he watched the young soldier receive his new rank while handing him a hot cup of black field coffee. Brennan would survive the European theater, returning home to Indiana after the war to work 3 decades as a master shop foreman for the National Railway System. For the rest of his life, Brennan kept a yellowed carbon copy of the company depot log from that wet November morning, recalling to his children how a private's sharp eye had saved a lead tank in front of George Patton. After Sergeant Brennan left the bay to resume his rounds, Cisneros sat quietly on an overturned wooden crate, pulling out the oilcloth-wrapped tobacco tin with his grease-stained thumbs. He opened the tin, took a long look at Dolores Vega's photograph, wiped a fresh smear of engine oil off the metal casing, and tucked it safely back into his chest pocket as another armored column roared past the depot into the rain. Was Patton right to accept the private's sharp mechanical correction over 3 senior officers in front of an entire motor pool full of soldiers? Some would say that publicly overruling 3 commissioned commanders in front of their subordinate mechanics severely eroded the traditional authority of the officer corps, setting a dangerous precedent that could threaten essential chain-of-command discipline during critical moments on a chaotic battlefield. Others would say exactly the opposite, that in the unyielding, cold arithmetic of modern mechanized warfare, where a single cracked engine mount can paralyze an armored spearhead, protecting the fragile pride of misdiagnosing officers is a dangerous luxury no advancing army can afford, and that elevating practical technical truth far above military rank was the purest form of combat leadership. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.